The bee has been on this planet for around 100 million years, long before humans, long before farming, long before any of the food systems we depend on today. For all that time, it has been doing one thing, moving between flowers, collecting food, and in the process carrying tiny grains of pollen from one plant to another. That one act is what makes most of the world's food possible. Not some of it, most of it. And for the past several decades, something has been going seriously wrong. Bee populations are falling. Scientists who have spent their careers studying this have been raising the alarm for years, and the world has not been paying attention. Today we are going to look at what is actually happening, why it is happening, where it leads, and whether there's still time to change it. Most people have a rough understanding of where food comes from. Farmers plant seeds. Seeds grow into crops. Crops get harvested and end up on shelves. But there's a step in that process that almost nobody thinks about. Before a plant can produce fruit or a seed, it has to be fertilized. And for the vast majority of flowering plants, that means pollen from one flower has to reach another flower of the same species. Plants cannot move. They cannot carry their own pollen. So over millions of years, they came up with a solution. They started producing nectar, a sweet liquid, to attract insects. The insects come for the nectar, and while they're feeding, pollen sticks to their bodies and travels with them to the next flower. The plant gets fertilized, the insect gets fed. It's one of the oldest arrangements in the history of life on Earth. Bees are by far the most important part of that arrangement. A single honeybee colony can hold up to 60,000 individual bees. Each one visits up to 2,000 flowers in a single day. When you multiply that across a whole colony, across an entire growing season, the scale of what they're doing becomes hard to grasp. What also makes bees different from other pollinators is something called buzz pollination. Bees can vibrate their flight muscles at a specific frequency that shakes pollen loose from certain flowers, in a way no other common pollinator can do. Tomatoes, blueberries, and peppers all depend on this. It cannot be replicated by machines at any meaningful scale. It's something only bees can do. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has found that out of 100 crop species that provide 90% of the world's food, 71 of them are directly pollinated by bees. Think about what that means in real terms. Every commercial almond in the world requires bee pollination. The almond industry in California, which produces around 80% of the global supply, brings in billions of managed bees every February just to pollinate the orchards. Without that, the entire industry collapses in a single season. Apples, cherries, blueberries, avocados, cucumbers, pumpkins, watermelons, coffee, cocoa, vanilla, all of them depend heavily on bees. The value of what bees contribute to global agriculture through pollination, not including honey, has been estimated at around $577 billion every year. That figure represents food that simply did not exist without bees. Some crops could survive without them, but in much smaller quantities and at much higher prices. Others would stop being commercially viable entirely. A world without bees is not a world where food gets a little more expensive. It's a world where the amount and variety of food available drops sharply, and the people most affected would be those who can least afford it. In 2006, beekeepers across the United States began reporting something they had never come across before. Worker bees were disappearing from hives, not dying inside the hive, just gone. A beekeeper would open a colony that had been healthy and find the queen still there, food still there, but the tens of thousands of worker bees simply absent. No bodies, no explanation. Scientists called it colony collapse disorder and spent years trying to understand what was driving it. In the years that followed, American beekeepers were losing between 30% and 40% of their managed colonies every year. Not once, year after year after year. In Europe, surveys of wild bee populations showed consistent long-term declines across most of the continent. In parts of China's Sichuan province, the situation had already gone further than warning signs. Intensive pesticide use had removed local bee populations entirely. Farmers there were pollinating apple and pear trees by hand, climbing trees with small brushes, dipping them into collected pollen, and touching each individual flower one at a time. It works on small farms. Nobody has worked out how to do it at the scale that bees currently operate across the entire world. The decline is not the result of one problem. It's three serious problems happening at the same time, and in many cases making each other worse. The first is a class of pesticides called neonicotinoids. Unlike older pesticides that sit on the surface of a plant, neonicotinoids are absorbed into every part of the plant, including the pollen and nectar that bees collect. When bees feed on treated plants, they take in the chemical. It doesn't always kill them straight away. What it does is more gradual. It interferes with their ability to navigate, so they struggle to find their way back to the hive. It damages their memory and learning, which bees depend on completely to locate food and communicate with the rest of the colony. And it weakens their immune system, making them far more vulnerable to everything else. The second problem is a parasite called the varroa mite. These mites attach to bees and feed on them while passing on a range of viruses that weaken and eventually destroy colonies. Varroa mites have now reached bee populations on almost every continent, and dealing with them has become one of the biggest ongoing challenges for beekeepers everywhere. The third problem is habitat loss. As natural land gets turned into farmland or housing, the variety of wildflowers that bees need for a balanced diet disappears. A bee living near a large single-crop farm has food available for the few weeks that crop is in bloom, and almost nothing for the rest of the year. A bee that is not eating well is far less able to deal with pesticides and parasites at the same time. The conversation about bees usually focuses on human food, but the consequences go much further. Around 80% of wild-flowering plant species on Earth depend on pollinators to reproduce. If bees disappear, the majority of those plants stop producing seeds. The animals that depend on those plants for food lose their food. The animals that depend on those animals lose theirs. The whole web of life that most land-based ecosystems are built on starts to break down from the bottom. Forests would change over time, as tree species that depend on bee pollination to reproduce gradually thin out. Wildflower meadows that support hundreds of other species of insects, birds, and small animals would shrink. The vegetation along rivers and streams would shift. These changes wouldn't happen overnight, but they would be very difficult to stop once they started, because natural systems are so deeply connected that removing one important part of them rarely produces a neat or predictable result.
The situation is serious, but it is not without real signs of progress, and that matters. In 2018, the European Union banned outdoor use of the 3 most widely used neonicotinoid pesticides after its Food Safety Authority concluded the risks to pollinators were too significant to continue. Early data from regions where the ban has been in place shows bee populations beginning to stabilize in some areas. It is not a full recovery, but it is a real change, and it shows that the damage is not permanent if the pressure is reduced. A growing number of farmers have started planting wildflower strips along the edges of their fields, giving bees access to a varied diet throughout the season rather than one crop for a few weeks and nothing after that. Research teams are making genuine progress on treatments for varroa mite infestations and on developing bee populations with natural resistance to the viruses they carry. Urban beekeeping has grown significantly in cities around the world, where the mix of flowering plants in parks, gardens, and street plantings provides better year-round foraging than many rural farming landscapes. None of these things alone fixes the problem, but together they represent real movement in the right direction. This is one of those problems where what individual people do genuinely matters. A garden planted with flowers bees can use, lavender, borage, clover, sunflowers, provides real food in areas where natural foraging has gone. A household that stops using pesticides removes one source of harm from the local population. Choosing food from farms that use pollinator-friendly methods sends a signal through the market that people care enough about this to factor it into what they buy. None of this replaces the policy changes that are also needed. Pesticide regulations, agricultural reforms, land management decisions, those things operate at a scale far beyond individual gardens, and they matter enormously. But the idea that nothing individuals do makes a difference is not right either. The problem got this serious partly because of a large number of individual decisions made over decades about what to spray, what to plant, and what land to convert. The same logic applies in the other direction. There is something worth thinking about in the fact that one of the most important animals on Earth weighs less than a paperclip and has a brain smaller than a grain of rice. The bee has no awareness of what it does for the world. It is not trying to feed humanity. It is just doing what it has always done, finding flowers, collecting food, going back home. And in doing that one simple thing for 100 million years, it became the foundation that an enormous amount of life on this planet is built on. We built our entire food system on top of that foundation without fully understanding it was there. Now that we do understand it, the question is simply whether we are willing to act on that understanding.
If you liked this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like and comment below if you enjoyed our video. We will see you in the next one.